Welcome to the Unlist. Today we are doing something a little bit different. Last year I did a Christmas Eve unicorn special, episode 198 I think, and I can't do that this year because my release dates don't fall the same way since the holidays tend to move around every year. Except for Thanksgiving, which is always a Thursday. But in April, also you've got Easter, which is always a Sunday. But other than that, the days tend to move around. And this year, my second video of this week falls after Christmas and not before. So it's a post-Christmas video this time. Sorry, guys. Can't be helped. I decided to do a little David versus Goliath thing where I take a single fragrance trope or concept, give you an extremely high-end and extremely low-end option, and discuss them with you. Now, when I say high-end and low-end, I don't mean in terms of market placement or status. I mean the literal price. We're taking a more pragmatic view of low-end, high-end. So the cheapest price available online from discounters and the highest price that you'll pay for a product, either retail or in some cases, Goliath can be a fragrance that's discontinued and unfortunately gets resold for a lot of money online. eBay gets scalped by the usual suspects, people who hoard and practice arbitrage on fragrances. So, whatever the case may be, David versus Goliath, cheap versus really expensive, same concept. Which one do you think comes out on top, right? I'll give you my opinion, and then you can decide. This first one is going to be a pretty common trope. It's the cool water trope. Ironically, cool water isn't part of this because cool water is neither David nor Goliath, since it falls somewhere in the middle in terms of pricing. If we need to do a true David versus Goliath with the cool water trope, we have to do it with Aspen as the David, and then of course Green Tweed as the Goliath. Why this and not cool water? Well, you can get cool water discounted for pretty cheap, but not as cheap as this. You can literally get Aspen for like $10. Sometimes you got to buy 2 bottles to get it for $10 per bottle because they'll want like 15 for one, 20 for two. So they're like, okay. So then you just buy the 2. Maybe you give your friend a bottle and he gives you $10. So there you go. You've paid $10. But that's around what this costs. 1989 release, originally released by Quintessence, which is the company that Jovon would become in time, become known as Quintessence. Cody would buy Jovon in 91, so Quintessence only sold Aspen for about 2 years. Became a Cody product thereafter. And it's awfully convenient because Cody wanted a contender in that cool water segment anyway, and they got one. So Aspen, if the color of the bottle doesn't clue you off, is a very green fragrance. It does still have comparable elements to the cool water style with the heavy hydromyrcenol and the ambroxan and the violet leaf and stuff like that to give it that really cool, sheer, soapy, filmy, cool water style, right? That we know, that aquatic style. But the fragrance is loaded down with more green materials. So it's got pine in it. It's got grassy, like cystery-hexanol style grassy notes. No like proper galbanum though. I don't really get much galbanum in here. But a lot of green notes. And the violet is stronger. And the base is a bit woodier too. So probably to hide the fact that they aren't going to use as much ambroxan, since remember, ambroxide of any kind was very expensive in the 80s. Any sort of ambroxide-based material, Cetilox, ambroxan, whatever the case may be, all of those ambroxide-based ambergris style musk replacers. That was new shit in the 80s. That was high tech. So very expensive. And that's why Cool Water was, believe it or not, quite an expensive formula when it came out. So they cut a lot of corners to get this to market. And one of the ways they did was backfill with green, woody notes so they could reduce the amount of the high-cost materials. So it's more aesthetically pleasing than Cool Water, in my opinion. But the reason why is to make it cheaper. Not because they necessarily wanted a greener fragrance. But I like it. You know, it's a win-win for me. Now, the Goliath is the origin of the species. This is where that whole thing started. 1985, a fragrance that was originally created to be submitted for the brief of Bellamy by Hermes. Perfumer being Pierre Bourdon, his idea was rejected. And this was kind of his baby. He had been working on this formula for a while and perfecting it. So he kind of did what Edmund Rudnitsky used to do and just hold on to it and shop it around to other people later until someone eventually picked it up. That's where Cool Water comes from. That was 3 years down the road. By that point, changes were made to the formula and it became more recognizably aquatic. But this version of the fragrance, it's an older version of the formula, is markedly different than Cool Water. It's much greener. This does have much bigger, almost, again with the cis-3-hexanol style notes, but there is a little bit of verbena in this as well, lemon verbena on top of the violet leaf. And there's also a little bit of galbanum in here and some iris notes. And of course, that very expensive Cetylox, which was like the higher end. If you're going to use any kind of ambroxide or ambroxan type of thing, Cetylox is the more expensive one. Now I think it's restricted. I think there's stuff in it that can't be used. It's reformulated, restricted, but it's what Creed likes to use. And of course, Creed claims there's a little bit of real ambergris. I don't know if there's real ambergris in this one. This is an older bottle, but it's not like, it's not the clear glass from the 90s that had the little label in the middle. That's older than this black bottle. So these black bottles came later. Originally, Green Irish Tweed was a clear bottle with a little, it had the same like cloth label that Bois de Portugal has. Remember the little cloth labels? That's how Green Irish Tweed was originally presented, in that same style bottle. Then he moved to a black bottle like this. Anyway, it doesn't matter. How do these compare? David versus Goliath. Well, honestly, as much as I love an underdog, you know me, I love my cheap fragrances. I love an underdog. I'm just going to smell them based on they've both been sprayed very recently. I've worn them both very recently, so what's on the sprayer is still quite fresh. And of course, my own memory, having just worn these. I hate to say it, but I really kind of give it to the Goliath. He takes the hammer and smashes David. David is now paste. Now, if you don't have the money to afford Goliath, even discounted, this is, well, let's see, how expensive is this? Let's find out. Yeah, okay, so I mean, if you're not ready to pull 3 figures for a bottle of cologne, like, you know, we're talking the high 100s, low 2s for a good discounted bottle of Green Irish Tweed, it's a lot of money. Then you probably just want to stick with the Aspen. Honestly, if for whatever reason Cool Water is too expensive for you, or you just want a greener version of it, but you don't want to go this far, it's a good deal. But just on virtue of the smell by itself, just the smell, price is not an issue. I think Goliath, unfortunately, wins this round. This first round, Goliath wins. Now, let's look at another David versus Goliath. Brut by Fabergé, released in 1964. This bottle is nearly empty, but I've got several more bottles right down here, ready to replace it once it's gone. But this is still the bottle I'm actively spraying, so it's going to have the most smell on the spray head. And then Sartorial by Penhaligon's, released in 2010. Quite a number of years later. Not quite 50 years later, but almost. That's 46 years later. Now, this is the David, this is the Goliath, because even in its vintage form like this, you can get these for cheap. $20. If you really look around, there was a period where I was finding vintage Fabergé Brut for like $15 a bottle. It's pre-pandemic prices, so that could easily be $30 now, but still. $30 for a deep vintage fougere of undisputable quality, it's pretty good. Even for $50. If you had to pay $50 for one of these, not that I'm encouraging you scalpers and assholes out there to charge more for your bottles, but it would still be a good fragrance. It might be less of a value at that point. And this guy here, ironically, this fragrance used to be a David, because there was a point where there were lots of Penhaligon's bottles sold at healthy discounts all over the internet. You could spend $35, $40 for just about any Penhaligon's you wanted. Those days are over because Puig bought the brand, and Puig just decided to turn them into basically a British tourist trap for rich Yanks kind of a brand, So it's British in the most caricature way, and all their fragrance are like the precocious Prince Peabody and, Lord Huffington Puffin stuff and his smelly guff. They literally call their fragrances these stupid names like this, and I've just given up on them. It's ridiculous. I think most people in the UK are really ashamed of Penhaligon's these days, and, I understand why. But that said, Sartorial is still, independently of all that garbage, or rubbish, as they would say, independent of all that rubbish, this is still a good fragrance by itself. Take it on its own merits. However, you can't pay $35 for it anymore. Now it's going to run you like $200. And because now it's just about locked into that price, anywhere you go, you're going to pay like at least $180 for this. Sometimes you get lucky, and Fragrance Net will have bottles for less than that, but yeah, it's expensive. So it's now gone from being the David to the Goliath. You could go even more expensive and pick things like Invasion Barbare, but I don't own a bottle of that, so I can't compare that one. I'm just going to stick with the most expensive version of this trope that I own, and that's going to be Sartorial. I don't have higher priced barbershop fougères than this. This is the most expensive one. So, how does David versus Goliath rank? Well, let's take a smell. Now, this is not necessarily the first fougère to have a powdery kind of vibe. We can go all the way back to Canu or Canois, if you want to say it the French way. Could go all the way back to stuff like that. But this was a new family tree branch off of stuff like Pinot and Canoe, because while those were much more vanillic fougères in general, they built around vanilla and carnation and tonka and were very rounded. This one went into a much sharper, powdery green floral direction. So stearyl acetate is in this. Much more jasmine, ylang ylang is in this. So much more floral heart, much more greener opening. And then it has these sort of really soapy nitro musks in the older bottles. Later bottles, that was banned, but these soapy nitro musks that really give it that shave foam feeling. And that was different from previous fougères. It was very modern, surprisingly modern for the time. And obviously there was shave foam made after this because of how popular it became. Bar soap and everything. Brut had it. At one point in time, Brut had everything. Nowadays, Brut barely exists. But this is a very quintessential man smell, okay? And I think it's the kind of thing that these days young people can appreciate too, because even if they didn't have parents who wore this, and so much time has passed now, they had grandparents who wore this, and it's that sort of postmodern, comfortable man smell. Now we go to the Goliath, and this is a fragrance that was clearly made in homage to the Brut. Now, Carl Mann, whose only fragrance credit is Brut, composed that one. Bertrand Duchefort, who has made many, many, many niche fragrances, is credited to this fragrance. And what did he do here? He basically tried to take that style of fougère and wrap it around the concept of a bespoke tailoring business. So a sartorial shop, a proper Savile Row tailor. So that means the smell of the wood. That means the smell of the hot steam pressing the fabric. That means the smell of the various leather goods that are sold in those places too. The whole aesthetic package. And thus you get a fougère that's very similarly in style to a Brut, but it's more metallic. It's got leather nuances and castoreum. It's a little more animalic, but a lot sharper and more compressed. And the green notes are basically gone. I love Sartorial. I love it a lot. But I only own one bottle of it. And one bottle of it will be a lifetime supply for me. If I want to smell like a fancy British gent who just stepped out of a Savile Row shop, I will wear this. But the other 85% of the time, 90% of the time, I'm going to wear Brut. Because it just, again, it's that perfectly balanced, quintessential, comfortable man smell. It is like Old Spice. It is like a lot of those men's fragrances. They were popular for a reason. Okay? And it wasn't because of TikTok. It wasn't because of going viral. They were popular for a reason. So David wins this one. His slingshot smacks Goliath in the face and he falls over. Sorry, Goliath. You lose. You lose this round. Bonus points to a fragrance like Vert Fougère by Floris, which is another high-end take. And they introduce ginger, licorice, and even more green notes. So they restore the green notes that Sartorial strips out. But then they also had other things too. And their version is a little funkier for that reason. But I like it. I like a little funky. A little funky works. So, now, we are going to do another David versus Goliath contest. And we are going to take No, let's not do that. Let's not do that one. You would expect that one. Yeah, let's do this one. Okay, yeah, let's do this one. Speaking of Jovon, we've got Jovon Intense Oud from 2012. Yeah, I know. Jovon made an oud fragrance. That is news for some people watching this video. I've talked about it before, but yeah, Jovon making an oud fragrance is kind of like McDonald's trying to make a Wagyu beef burger. It's just you would not expect it. And the results are about what you would expect of that effort as well. And then on the Goliath side of this, we've got Floris Leather Oud, which among all the different ouds I have, this is the only one that's truly comparable to this. And that may be an insult to the Floris for some people who've smelled this, but it's best that I got, man. It's as close as I can get. So both of these fragrances have a sort of geranium, heavy accented rose oud accord, where the rose is more rose geranium and not straight actual rose. That's why this comparison is being made. I don't have another rose oud that subs out rose for rose geranium, because most rose ouds commit to the Turkish rose, the damask rose. They go with those darker, heavier roses. They don't go, let's use rose geranium, because it's a whole lot cheaper and we can just make it with geraniol and a little bit of damascenone and call it a day. Like, most rose ouds are a bit more serious than that, but this Jovon here, so Jovon is going to do Jovon and be cheap. Now with Floris, they chose the rose geranium for aesthetic reasons, not for cheap reasons. They could have used rose oil in this. They can afford rose oil because they're fucking Floris. Of course they can afford rose oil. So if they're using rose geranium, it has to be thematic to the fragrance. There's a reason why they did it, and it's not to cut costs. It's because it fits with what they're doing with the perfume. And in this case, yes, geranium is very popular with men, especially British men, and leather notes and oud, so they used rose geranium in place of rose to make this more man-friendly. You know, not that they don't have men's rose fragrances in the UK, because they absolutely do. Even Floris has a few, but they were trying to make this a bit more masculine, and doing that with a pure rose note is kind of hard, you know. Now, in this David versus Goliath contest, David is like 99% synthetic, and oh boy, you can tell. Like, they're using the same Firmenich compound to make oud that you will find in Oud 27 by Le Labo. If you've smelled Le Labo Oud 27, you know what I'm talking about. It's that compound. It's a specific Firmenich synthetic oud compound. Dior Leather Oud also uses it, and Oud, I think it's Ispahan, yeah, Oud Ispahan by Dior. The Dior ouds in general from their Privé range use the same Firmenich material. And Jovon is also using it, except Jovon can't afford to use a lot of it. So they use a very tiny amount, very minuscule amount of that compound. Because even though it's synthetic, it's still expensive. Then they backfill the rest with Isoe Super and gummy, like, amber notes, you know, typical MFK style gummy amber notes, really sweet gummy notes. So you've got that isoe super wood, that tiny bit of the Firmenich oud material, the amber material, and then you've got that big rose geranium on top with a little bit of synthetic citrus notes. And when you first spray this on, it actually smells pretty impressive. Like for the first, I don't know, first 30 minutes, you're impressed. You're like, wow, that's a pretty decent oud fragrance from Jovon, like a $12, $15 bottle, right? It's pretty impressive. But then once the dry down hits, then the truth is revealed of just how cheap this fragrance actually is. And for me to call a fragrance cheap, you know, I like my cheap fragrances, so if I'm saying it smells cheap, then it smells cheap. And it's like a paper tiger. It's all roar for the first 30 minutes. You're like, ah, rose, oud, delicious. And then suddenly you get that backfill, and it's not harsh. Don't get it twisted. It's not a harsh fragrance. It's not an unpleasant fragrance, okay? It's enjoyable, but it's a McDonald's cheeseburger with a little bit of oud on top. So it's very much, it is what it is. And then you've got Floris leather oud, which is very high quality, even though it too probably has a synthetic oud compound, because no one's using real oud oil unless they want to sell you a $300 fragrance. This is just about $300, but I mean, you know what I mean. Okay, whatever. Let's not. I'm tired. It's late. I shouldn't even be doing it this hour, but I'm doing it. So appreciate my efforts, even when I make slip-ups. Okay, a $500 fragrance. There you go. Proper oud fragrance. But the rest of the fragrance is built with much greater care, much more quality. It's rich. It's redolent. The leather is very nice. The amber notes that are in this are also very nice. The rose geranium is a proper rose geranium, so it's a thick, nice, rounded rose geranium. And then there's carnation in here as well, which is completely lacking from the Jovon. There's carnation in here. There's really good citrus notes in here as well, bergamot, and a little bit of aldehyde up top. And yeah, it's a proper rose geranium oud. If you ever wanted a rose geranium specifically oud, then you want Dior leather. You want, sorry, not Dior, Floris. You want Floris leather oud. This is what you want. David versus Goliath. I'm sorry, Goliath wins. David gets flattened again. Squished into jelly. Okay. Now, for our last David versus Goliath, I'm going to use this fragrance and this fragrance. So, our David is Azzaro from 1978, and our Goliath is Un Homme, Charles Jourdan, released in 1979, only a year later. These were originally in the same market space in terms of price, but this became extremely popular, sold extremely well for years, and has so much stock on the market that you can pick this up relatively affordably. Deep vintage bottles are going to be expensive, but we're not doing deep vintage. We're just doing what's around, you know. This is a slightly older bottle. They're no longer 6 sides, they're now 8 sides. But even bottles from this era, which is about 15 years ago, are still relatively inexpensive. 30, 40, 50 bucks. You know, the brand new ones are like $20. But if you want to go a little bit older and have oak moss listed on the bottle, you know, like in the ingredients here, then you can get like one for $50 and you're good. This, on the other hand, only sold one batch. It was a one and done, didn't sell well, was basically discontinued within a couple years, and then lingered in the aftermarket for decades. Used to be cheap because nobody wanted it, but then once the online fragrance community became a thing and people began talking, suddenly the bottles began getting snapped up, and what went from like a hidden gem that was affordable, if you know, you know, ended up being a massive discontinued unicorn that sells upwards of $250 to $300 sometimes. You get lucky if you buy splashes. They're under $2. You know, they're 100 and some. But the good spray bottles like this, I mean, I'm looking at one right here, and dude's wanting $250 for it. So I'm not saying it's worth that necessarily, but that's what you're going to pay. So David is $30, $50 for an oak moss bottle. Goliath is 3 to 4 times that easily. So because of the rarity and the unicorn hype and all that. Smell wise, they are very close. The only real difference between these two is the Azzaro, both containing oak moss, mind you, but the Azzaro focuses a little more on that oak moss. And that oak moss is also surrounded with an old school Mousse de Saxe style leather accord. So, I mean, they weren't using Mousse de Saxe in the 70s, so it's synthetic. But it's got that anisic alcohol meets oak moss meets leather, isobutylquinoline leather. So that's what Mousse de Saxe primarily was. So it's got this Mousse de Saxe style base underneath of it, which when you combine it with the anise and the lemon, the really bright lemon in the opening, just makes like one of the perfect, again, like with Brut, very quintessential masculine fragrance. Like the comfort, you know, you smell it, it's a man smell, it's a dude smell. It's good dressed up, it's good dressed down, it's good at a restaurant, it's good at a ball game, it's good in the winter, good in the summer. It's one of those you could throw all your other bottles away and only have one bottle for the rest of your life, and you can make it this bottle, and that would be a good choice. This one, well, this one has plenty of oak moss too, especially because all the bottles are deep vintage. There aren't really modern bottles of this. They're only bottles from the 70s and maybe early 80s. The production run for however long it was are all the bottles that exist. There are no reformulations, so you're going to get good stuff material-wise. That's just, it's a given. The aesthetic changes. So this was created by Gerard Anthony, Richard Herpin, and one other guy. This was made by Francois Caron, who was at the time married to Pierre Bourdon, who was his ex-wife. So what she basically did with this fragrance is she looked at this and she actually toned down the oak moss a little bit, and she subbed it with sandalwood. Mysore sandalwood, actually. So there is a very big, rich sandalwood note in this fragrance. And this fragrance also tones down the anise a little bit and turns up the lavender. So the lavender is rounder, a little bit more aromatic, a little creamier, I would say. The tonka is a little heavier in this fragrance as well. And it's also a bit more herbal. So if you like basil and you like tarragon and things like that. So more herbal, rounder, more lavender, more sandalwood, but then you're turning down the leather, you're turning down the oak moss. So it's rounder and more plush and not as clean, not as sharp as Azzaro. So it's a tough one because they're both really good. But at the end of the day, I got to go with my gut, and I got to say that David, once again, slingshots Goliath in the forehead and knocks them over, because this is not a desert island fragrance, okay? Despite its rarity and its cred in the online community or whatever, pats on the back you want to give me for owning a bottle of this, I don't give a fuck. This is the one that's coming with me on the desert island, not this one. This one can stay on land. All right, some lucky asshole can find it and keep it. This one's going to join me if I'm stranded somewhere. And that's it, guys. That is my David versus Goliath episode. Okay. 2 fragrances in the same train of thought. One really cheap, one really expensive. We're 2 and 2. So we're having a complete tie. Maybe I'll do a part 2 of this, and then we'll get a tiebreaker and see who wins. Or maybe I'll just forget about it and make a bunch of other videos and we'll never come back to it again. Who knows? It's a mystery when it comes to me. Hope you enjoyed your Christmas and hope you have a happy New Year. And I will see you later.